Hello, you're watching Telecom TV. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and welcome to our live Q&A program on automating data center operations. Juniper Networks and Analysys Mason have collaborated on a new survey with 30 communication services providers to find out why and how the introduction of automated processes for data center operations can be accelerated and managed. Now, we unveiled the results of the survey on Tuesday, and if you haven't yet seen that discussion program, don't worry, you can watch it on demand later. Just follow the links below this video player window. Today, though, we're going to be sharing more thoughts about the survey and what it means for CSPs, as well as answering your questions during this live show. Now, there's a form here on the website for you to submit them. We have already received quite a few following our earlier program, but we would still like more. So if you haven't already done so, then please send us your questions now. We have about 45 minutes remaining, so don't delay. Well, let's now meet our guests, and taking part in today's live Q&A show are Gorkem Yigit, Principal Analyst at Analysys Mason, Michael Bushong, VP Cloud Ready Data Center at Juniper Networks, and Ernest Altbart, IT Architect at Raiffeisen Informatik. Welcome all of you. Thanks so much for taking part today. Now, before we get to our first viewer question, Mike, let me first of all ask you, what is Juniper's philosophy when it comes to data center networking? And nice hair, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, green is my natural color. So the green, just to kind of dispel that, we had an internal bet inside our company. Depending on how you look at it, I either won or I lost, and so I am now green. In terms of just data center philosophy, I think the philosophy is fairly straightforward. In the physical switching layer, we let the economics and the physics dictate the choice. The industry is largely settled on how we build physical data centers. It's typically merchant silicon led, building out fabrics with EVPN or BGP. And once we standardize that, it means the action moves from on the box to above the box. Philosophically, we believe that it's all about operations. And within operations, the thing to optimize for, it's not necessarily going only for speed, it's about reliability. It's about making sure people can do things the right way every time without fail. We've embraced this whole concept of intent-based networking, which is the idea that we should be declarative. We should say what we want and allow the tools to translate what we want into how we get it. Because the future is decidedly multi-vendor, the future is it's decidedly automated, it's software defined, and so that's really where the action is, where most of our customers are engaging, and frankly, where I think most of the decisions will be made over the next decade. I think that's basically where we're headed.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. And why did you engage Analysys Mason to conduct this survey for you?
So, if we're convinced that the action is in the operations space, if we believe that automation is where things go, if we believe that things like intent-based models are the way to solve pain, we're absolutely convinced of that. But if you look at just industry traction, people aren't moving as fast as you would expect. And this is actually a conversation. Operations is a conversation that's more than a decade old at this point. And what we wanted to know was, frankly, why? What are people seeing? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? What are the things that are driving their behavior? And frankly, we can have all the opinions we want, but what we need is actual data to complete the analysis so that we can help meet people where they are. Because frankly, as an industry, we've sunk, I would argue, millions of people hours into trying to solve the problem, and yet the problem still persists. So how do we get enough information to take action? How do we become more helpful, understanding that this isn't a pure technology problem? There's more that sits behind it. But what's the nature of that? What's holding people up? And then frankly, what opportunities does that create? How does that change engagement? And then finally, how do we help? So the hope was that a survey like this would would really open up some more specifics, allowing us to plug in where people are and then get them to where, frankly, we all know we want to be.
Great, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So, Gorkem, moving across to you, we need to understand more, as Mike says. So tell us about the survey you conducted and the key results you discovered.
Sure, yeah. So we did a quite detailed online survey with 30 large tier 1 communication service providers around the world. And it included both strategy people and technical staff. And in addition to that, we had in-depth conversations with 5 other CSPs to drill into their data center automation approach. So we asked them about their key drivers and trends for their data center strategies, the current state of their data center network automation, their future plans, and the main challenges and the barriers they are facing today. And we have several very interesting findings surfaced from this research. First of all, in terms of the key drivers and the trends, we see that the CSP data center strategies are shaped around 3 main areas. One is the new opportunities in the enterprise managed services and connectivity market. And the second is network cloudification for 5G, including the cloud-native transformation of 5G mobile core and radio access network. And the third is the deployment of new edge computing locations in order to support both 5G and the enterprise and the consumer edge services. So all these new services and the networks, they need highly automated and programmable data centers to run on. However, when we look at the current state of most CSP data centers, they're not really ready for the requirements of 5G edge and the new service opportunities I just mentioned. CSPs have made very limited progress in terms of automating their data center network operations across day 0, day 1, and day 2 processes. And also, they don't really show a strong ambition or urgency to address that in the near term, and which I believe poses a significant risk to their aspirations. And we identified 3 main barriers and inhibitors causing this low level of automation. And the first one, the top barrier we found was the operational complexity, and it stems from the highly fragmented data center network technologies and operations, because CSPs, they have a lot of vendor-specific and domain-specific silos, which makes it very hard to rationalize and automate their data center networks. And as Mike said, it's not just about the technology. We also found some operational and organizational challenges. For example, the most CSPs are finding it difficult to justify the business case for the automation investments. And this is not because there is not a business case, but it is that most CSPs, they struggle to understand the business case and gather the data internally to build that. And finally, we found that CSPs have an entirely different mindset towards data center networking and automation compared to the enterprise and hyperscalers. Most CSPs don't have an automation-first mindset, and they are more accustomed to throwing more people as human glue to solve their problems, or doing very expensive custom integrations, or developing ad hoc tools. So overall, they're generally behind the hyperscalers and even most enterprises when it comes to data center automation.
Fascinating. Thanks very much for that, Gorkem. And a reminder that there is a link below this video and you can access the research yourself. Now, Ernest, let's come across to you, because we invited you to this panel because Rifasons is a service provider that is at the forefront of network automation. So your perspective is really going to be useful here. Tell us more about your business, and do these survey findings that Gorkem has been talking about, do they resonate with you?
Well, first, for our business, we are an IT service provider in the business for 50 plus years, mainly targeting the Raiffeisen group here in Austria and in Eastern Europe. There's banks and insurances in there, so there's a lot of different use cases for over the decades we deployed IT infrastructure for. So we have a lot of experience, and one of the findings that resonates is one thing Gorkem said just before. That's the mindset. I think it takes a very long time to develop a mindset that really drives you towards automation. You have to feel the pain, obviously, which we have felt over the decades in doing so. And also to develop the need for standardization, to really develop a standard for certain infrastructures that you deploy and run. I think that comes over time, because in the first places, you always think, I can manage, I can do that by hand. And you, of course, do it by hand in the first place, because you usually drive POCs and stuff like that. And that's not where you deploy full automation. But at a certain point, when you put it into production, it should be there. And that's a hard transition to do. So that's one thing that resonates quite well, of course. I would maybe like to add two more angles that were key drivers for us. That's complexity of the infrastructure that can hardly be managed any other way than by automation, because the technologies we use become increasingly complex and increasingly complicated, actually, to deploy and to run, from just the number of parameters. Think eVPN, BGP, VXLAN fabrics, for instance. There's a lot of neighborships going on, a lot of parameters and IP addresses to fill in. Doing that by hand in a medium to large scale is next to impossible to do error-free. That's one angle. The other relates to that a little bit. It's targeted towards people, because when you look at the networking industry, and that's something I learned from my engagement with Juniper in the course of the last months, was that it's actually a global problem. It's something we experienced here in Austria, that there is not many people wanting to join the networking industry. So there's not young guys coming up. You have a problem in the HR area, where to get people in the correct skill set, if you want. And therefore, you need to find a way to deal with additional features, with additional scale, with additional data centers, networks, targets, etc. And one way, of course, to deal with that is to increase your level of automation, because then you can actually use the same amount of people, skillful people, for those things, and scale much more easily than you could if you'd deployed a manual or even semi-manual method of doing that. So those two things are something that were key drivers for us as well.
So, Ernest, it does sound like there's a lot of factors, there's many factors that you need to balance if you're going to successfully implement this. Absolutely,
yeah. Short anecdote here, of course, there's the purchasing angle as well. I think Mike mentioned it before, that the vendor independency, that's also something that any purchasing department strives for and would like to achieve. I think I don't need to tell the audience how hard that has been over the last decades. With an automation layer that sort of abstracts the hardware to a certain extent, I have to say. It's not a free-for-all where you can deploy whatever box you wish, just bought around the corner. But when you do an abstraction of your hardware, it gives you a certain kind of freedom. And here's a short example. In the latest RFP we did, that was right at the beginning of that, let's call it global chip crisis, where the supply chains get increasingly under stress and delivery times prolong themselves, more or less. We were actually free to name 3 hardware vendors and to do that and tell them whoever can deliver first. We'll take your equipment because we could do that from the tool set we had deployed. Of course, purchasing loved that, and that was an angle that is important, or could be important when you say under time stress. Luckily for us, it all fit well together, and we got our number one of the RFP, so we were kind of lucky in that regard. But it just gave us the opportunity to do that if necessary. So that's also quite an interesting angle, I thought, in the process. Wouldn't have anticipated that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ernest, for that. Now, we've been calling for your questions, viewer questions for this program. And here's one we received in. Mike, I may put this one to you first, possibly. Let me read the question out. The lack of standardization was identified as the number one barrier to data center automation in the white paper. So who, therefore, should be leading the standards push? Mike, is that one you're able to take a stab at first?
Certainly have opinions. Standardization tends to be a team sport. I think what most people believe is that people have to show up. Companies, vendors have to agree fundamentally. There's standards bodies that emerge. Obviously we've got long-time standards bodies like IETF. We've got emergent groups that come together like ONUG that all kind of aspire to provide, guidance. I will tell you this though, having run standards bodies before, it's not only incumbent upon the providers of technology to drive things. I'll tell you what moves needles is adoption. Frankly, dollars will drive, or euros or whatever currency, right, will drive behavior. And so what needs to happen, frankly, is that people need to move away from what I would call legacy architectural practices. Ernest commented on there's a mindset change. The mindset is also what I call the derivative RFP. When most people build out infrastructure, what they do is they take an Excel spreadsheet that had all the requirements of the old infrastructure, and then they add 2 or 3 lines at the bottom. We are reasonably good as an industry at picking up new things. We are horrific as an industry at retiring old things. And it's this sprawling technology bits that actually are a greater inhibitor. I think standard APIs are fine, but common and sort of openly defined API layers can get past a lot of that, even if they're not standard, as long as they're unchanging, they're well documented, and they're well used. And then we can handle things like versioning, so they're not changing all the time. Like if that happens, we can make progress. But the thing that's very difficult is managing diversity. Ernest also mentioned the whole complexity angle. The more things we have, the more difficult it is. And I think, fundamentally, it's this, and in the CSP market in particular, by the way, we have a tendency to sweat our assets. We want to hold on to the technology as long as we can because it drives a better return, right? You don't want to decommission a service. The side effect of that, though, is that these things linger, and they don't linger for a few quarters or a few years. They linger for decades. And when that happens, it means that anytime we bring in like an automation or an abstraction layer, we're not abstracting something clean. You're abstracting, decades of technical debt. And that, frankly, is near impossible. And so when we think about who drives the standards, I would say flip that conversation a bit and let's develop a practice of removing things. One of the things I tell customers all the time is make a list of everything you have, right? The number of devices, the versions of operating system, the different protocols and technologies you have provisioned, the firewall rules that are exist across the whole environment. Make that list and then record what you add to it and record what you take away. And if that list isn't meaningfully smaller year on year, you're moving in the wrong direction. You can't standardize when it's a million things. What you can standardize when things are relatively small. And I think that's what we've learned from like the hyperscalers. Instead of bending the infrastructure to the applications, they bent the applications to the infrastructure. Like that's a bigger, more bang for your buck kind of change that I think we make. So I would say encourage customers. I guess I know a long answer, but I would encourage users in the space to really take control of their destiny and think less about how do you incrementally change and more about how should you design, what are the architectural principles you'll base it on, and then automation becomes a much easier task.
Great points there, Mike. Thank you very much for that answer. Well, let's therefore move on because we've got another audience question in here. Gorkem, let me put this one to you. Based on the survey findings, what do you recommend that CSPs do in the near future? Yeah.
Well, I think our research makes it very clear that the CSPs should take action urgently, and they really need to increase their focus and the investments in the data center automation, given that the new 5G and edge services, they're just around the corner, and automation is a long journey. And CSPs cannot really afford the risk of waiting for end-of-life replacement or technology refresh cycles. So as a first step, I would recommend CSPs to establish their priorities and timings for which parts of the data center networks and processes they need to automate. And of course, this should be in line with their the business strategies and objectives. And another key step in this journey, I would say, will be tackling the technology fragmentation and the complexity I mentioned earlier. And one way to do that is adopting a horizontal multi-vendor abstraction and automation platform. And because operators, they really need to collapse these existing silos, and they need to move to more intent-driven and automation-first approach for their data center operations. And going forward, CSPs, they need to think about introducing new policies and mechanisms in order to prevent, this vendor-dependent, bottoms-up approach to data center designs. As Mike mentioned, there are lots of legacy technologies, technical debt, so this cannot repeat again. So, for example, they can institute a board or a central group that oversees the introduction of any new data center technologies, and they would insist that any new vendor conforms to the data center automation plan and the regime the operator is already in place. And we are seeing similar approaches to this by advanced operators in their 5G cloud platforms already. And lastly, I would say all this automation and the transformation is not something that CSPs should take on alone, because they need suitable technology partners to help with this journey. So they need to look for external partners that have extensive automation experience, and not only with other CSPs, but also with hyperscalers and enterprises, so that they can get the solutions and the professional services to help ease the transformation, the cost, disruption, and the risk.
Great, thanks, Gorkem. And Mike, you'd like to add some comments as to what CSPs should be doing in the near term?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the opening comments that Gorkem made about business case. The other thing I would add is you've got to instrument your environment. We're decent as an industry at instrumenting our services. What's performance look like? In the operations space, we don't always have information. If you're a leader in the space, it's things like decision support. How do you know how much time you saved? How do you know things like opportunity cost? That requires a little bit of thought, and it's not just about how many heads can I remove. It's about how much more effective can I make people? How do I improve productivity? I think you have to measure that, and I think that has to become part of the operating environment. And it's more than deploying a technology. At some point, you got to understand what your baseline is, and that gives you some idea, by the way, of competitive benchmarking, which allows people to compete in this space. I think paying attention to how you justify decisions is really important and often overlooked because it doesn't necessarily drive the specific service in the moment. But Gorkem talked about a couple of things that are important, right? The proliferation of edge clouds and 5G. I mean, it's basically a trade-off. We're saying we're going to make lots of small data centers that are going to be independently operated. The way you pay for that effectively is through operations. If you don't instrument that environment, you're never going to know if the economics are going to play out as you think they should.
Thanks, Mike. And Gorkem, just to be absolutely clear here, unless they've already started, of course, CSPs should start this journey as soon as possible. It's not just simply part of a technology replacement lifecycle. You're
absolutely right, yes. So as part of this research, we had conversations with operators, and some of them, their thinking was more around, yes, we are going to think about network automation, SDN, and programmability when the next technology lifecycle investment starts. So they're more like, okay, let's wait and see. If we didn't really see the urgency, and there's the disconnect between all that 5G and edge aspirations and the attention and the level of interest that is going into the automation at the moment. So, and our research, I think it's very clear that they're already late. Because first of all, automation takes time. There's not like a magical solution. So there are going to be significant migration and modernization activities they need to take place to get there, right? And so given the the low levels of its automation we see in the CSP data centers today, waiting for the next replacement cycle would mean jeopardizing your 5G and edge opportunities, because the data center network fabric and its automation is becoming an essential underpinning of their business.
Great, thanks for those comments to that question. And a reminder to our viewers, please keep sending in your questions. We are about halfway through our program now. Ernest, let me come back to you. As a company that's at the forefront of network automation and is one of those companies that's well on the way in this journey, tell us what have been your keys to success?
Well, first of all, we're not finished yet. It's a never-ending journey. It goes on and on and on and on. The keys to success is, I think, again, a mindset approach. We discovered fairly early and didn't even know that there were fitting solutions out there at the time, that the level of complexity I mentioned earlier can only be managed with an automation layer of some kind. So we didn't know exactly what we were looking for. We just knew, this has to be automated. It's way too big and too complicated to do that by hand. I mentioned the people angle earlier as well. So I guess a key factor in our success, if you want, is being aware of where some key challenges were. I'm not saying we discovered them all, because there will be surprises along the way. You will have problems. This is IT. This is a given. Actually, this is something. There's something in it you didn't think of all the time and you didn't anticipate. But I think an awareness, much like Gorkem managed, you need to do it now. This was actually one of the thoughts we had during the beginning of our process here. I have to admit, though, it coincided with a life cycle, so this makes it, of course, a lot easier to do that when you know that you have to do something, and it's actually driven by some end of life or end of sale announcements by your former hardware vendor. So that helps. But I think the awareness of many angles is a key factor in that journey. Might be also that with 50 years of experience that you get a little more angles in the back of your head than companies that are not that long in the market. So that could also have helped in that regard. But I'd stick with the general awareness of that you need to do it now. As Gorkem so aptly put it, now is actually too late. The best time to start was 2 years ago.
And Ernest, you mentioned the issue of complexity there. Is it a case that you usually can't get rid of complexity completely, but you can either hide it or you can manage it, and this is the whole point of automation?
It absolutely is. You never get rid of it. Our company exists for 50 plus years. There's a legacy environment that's there that doesn't go away just because you're doing something new. You have to deal with it, and therefore the complexity, of course, stays to a larger amount. But what you can do is, I'm going back to the beginning now, standardization is something that we have been striving for over a couple of decades, and is something we, of course, never fully achieved, but is something that we were always targeting for. But having the tools to do that is of course, lightening the situation a lot. And by that intent-based networking, when you set an intent and you have the tool set to keep that intent, that is a very strong support factor in any standardization drive you have and deploy. And that's something that enables you again to run in a very smooth way, in fast and stable. And that's the main characteristics that our customers, think banking and insurance again, want from their IT infrastructure. They're not so much concerned about knobs and whistles. They're really, really concerned about, does it run 24/7? Because this is where payment and insurance contracts run over, and that's the main business driver for them. What it boils down to technologically, that's our job to do. And of course, once you standardize things and they're all done in the same way, it's very likely that they run a lot more smoothly than when you're dealing with an anthill of complexity in your data center.
Sure. Thank you, Ernest, for those views. Now, we've had a question in that's of a similar type of question to the last one here. So perhaps Mike and Gorkem, I could put this to you. And Mike, perhaps I could start with you. And it's about complexity. And the question is, how do you resolve the operational complexity problem? Because this was a big problem that was identified in the research. And as Ernest has also said, but is there an easy solution here?
Is there an easy solution? I don't know that there's easy solutions for most of what we're doing. I mean, there's an inherent complexity and challenge in what CSPs have to do broadly. I think in terms of how do you address the complexity, I do think we've talked a bit about how do you standardize around designs. I think snowflake designs are the enemy. Everything that you add that's different and diverse is challenging. I think that you have to elevate. So Ernest talks a lot about abstraction. You have to elevate operations, not just above the box, but above the network. Ideally, if you move to declarative models, the whole premise of intent-based networking, just as a movement, is this idea that you ought to say what you want, not necessarily how you want it. When you do that, the software controllers act as effectively API brokers, translating intent into underlying behavior. That's what provides the multi-vendor elements, by the way. So when Ernest talks about that procurement advantage or the lead time challenge, right, the only way you can get that is if your operations aren't twiddling in vendor-specific CLI, but are rather looking at kind of declarative intent, allowing the system to adjust to what the underlying devices are. I think standardized designs that are templated or blueprinted so that you can essentially stamp the same thing out over and over and over again, that's critical. As we talk about the proliferation of edge cloud, the rollout of 5G, which moves from these large national data centers to highly distributed, what that means is that you're going to replace very large data centers with lots of very small data centers, and that means that we've got to create those as similarly as possible so we can reduce the kind of the technology and design sprawl that would otherwise lead to even additional complexity. And then on top of all of that, you can't leave things like choice and flexibility out. So ideally, it's about how do you do all that with a uniform operations layer. I want my operations to be consistent, allow the economics, the lead times, the physics to dictate my underlying choices. So you've got to then build out explicitly abstraction bits. It means that it's a bit of an ecosystem play instead of like all in on here's my one vendor. And that's important because that's how you diversify risk, by the way. And the current supply chain crunch should teach us all that that's important. So it's how do you design abstraction at the top? And I want to go back to the people side of that, right? It's not only a technology problem, right? The reason we customize is because we want control. There's a bit of a control trade-off, which you have to agree to, is that you don't want everything to be, finely tuned, highly tailored to a specific environment. You've got to be willing to say, look, I'm going to go in with well tested, blueprints or kind of archetypes for different data centers that I want, and then you have to have the discipline to maintain that. The tooling can help, but there's a policy angle, a corporate policy angle that comes in behind that to really support it. If you can provide both of those, the tooling and sort of the cultural support, then I think you have not just a chance. I think you can be successful. And what's interesting is because it's such a difficult thing to do, that success will create outsized business benefits for the overall business, and it'll drive a much better experience for the customers that attach.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. Well, look, we do have quite a few more questions to get through, so perhaps we should move on to our next question. A lot of these questions are connected. Gorkem, here's another question here. How do service provider data center strategies vary based on geography? Is there any variance dependent upon where they're situated?
Yes, absolutely. And I would recommend anyone to go back and watch the first part of this series where I explain all these variances in detail. I can still give you an overview. So when we looked at the overall data center strategies by geography, we found stark differences between the Western world and the East, especially Asia Pacific. So North American and Western European CSPs, they've been reducing and consolidating their traditional data centers for a while now because they are transforming their IT and the networks with public cloud and the SaaS providers. And they're also looking to cut their data center capex. But of course, there are still plenty of traditional data centers these CSPs still own and operate. However, the CSPs in Asia Pacific are actually adding new data center sites and capacity because a lot of them are actually in the business of providing data center services. And historically, public cloud providers' presence in those regions weren't as strong as in the Western world. So when we looked at the data center automation specifically, we actually found some quite interesting results. Some CSPs in Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Latin America, they reported higher levels of data center automation than their peers in North America and Western Europe. And we believe one of the reasons for this is that the CSPs in these regions, they have newer technology data centers as they continue to invest in building new data centers, and new technologies come with more automation. In North America and Western Europe, on the other hand, there is still a lot of legacy in CSP data centers, and that needs transformation and modernization. So this might be the impact of the data center footprints and the capex reduction strategies that we see in these regions.
Great, thank you. And I'll just echo what Gorkem said there. If you haven't seen the first part in this series yet, then you ought to. If you can, there's a link below this video player window. Now, Mike, question to you. Based on your experience, what are you hearing from your customers about how they're building the business case to automate data center operations?
So there's two ways to fundamentally build the business case. One is kind of cost avoidance. The other is preparing for growth and looking at how do you accelerate. On the cost avoidance side, it's really how do you become more efficient, and that's benchmarking the things that you have to do, and then building out the tools to make that easier to do. I want to caution people here that if the goal of automation is that you're simply going to remove people, I think that's a bit of a narrow goal, right? I think we have to look at how do we best deploy our folks. I look at it as removing the toil. Like, how do you get people out of the things that are time consuming but not necessarily difference making, the things that ought to be automated, and allow them to apply their specialist skills in support of things that are more difference making. Ernest talked earlier about the difficulty of just maintaining staffing. This whole pandemic and work from home thing is opening up hiring worldwide. And that is very challenging because it means companies that were traditionally hiring in major tech hubs can hire from anywhere, and that puts people under pressure. And as those people leave, it's like, how do you get the remaining workforce to be as productive? Like, that's, I think you got to think about that, from just a business case perspective. How quickly do you onboard? What does your recruitment and talent look like? On the other side, there's a kind of a growth perspective, which is, for every unit of growth, what happens to operations spend? Ideally, your operations don't grow linearly with the size or footprint of your overall services, and so there's an element there that says how profitably can we grow services. I think that's the other kind of more obvious angle. You put those two together, though, and you get a kind of a mix of opportunity cost along with additional online capacity going forward. Like, that's how I would build the business case. I think it allows you to make a case to management that says, allow us to be more effective and really look at the kind of the bottom line while simultaneously supporting the growth initiatives required to drive top line growth.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. And Ernest, we have another question for you. How do you see your data center operations evolving in the next 5 years?
Well, that's a good one, actually. Much like in the data center fabric environment, if you want, where you have obviously an automation solution deployed, there's similar environments all around those infrastructures, like the SD-WAN area, the software-defined data center approaches that usually pop up, cloudified everything that pops up. All of those infrastructure areas have a certain networking layer aspect to it and incorporated, actually. So we would see ourselves developing in the direction of integrating those infrastructures together, one way or the other. It's kind of hard to see and say how this is going to be implemented. And of course, drive the abstraction over all these infrastructures, so you can actually deploy features in a similar manner or in a connected manner, because it might be that a WAN circuit and then a software-defined data center tenant might want to talk to some data center pods that you deploy for X customer, and that needs to be implemented in a certain way. And if you do it in 3 different areas, that might get complicated. So we will probably look in that direction. Of course, again, when you do it now, you have a chance of having it once you need it. The immediate need might not be here right now, because consciously we decided just to target data center automation at this point in time. But I think things like that will pop up in the next couple of years, say 5 years or something like that. And this is where we think towards to.
Fascinating. Thank you for that, Ernest. We've still got a few more questions we want to get through, even though we are approaching the end of our show. Let's try and get through a few more if we can. Gorkem, let me put this one towards you. The question is, do CSPs have different strategies for their edge data centers?
It's not really different, but our research showed that there is strong interest in building new edge data centers from the CSPs across all regions. So despite the differences we see in the traditional data centers, it is quite contrary for the edge. All operators, they have strong interest to build out new edge locations. For example, they are typically in the regional or metro data centers, and in some cases on the cell sites. And we are also seeing there are two main drivers behind this edge data center investments. The first is the new enterprise edge clouds, of course, in order to provide new IoT operational technology and enhance ICT services. And the second is the network edge clouds to host the 5G functions such as vRAN and Open RAN. And interestingly, the CSPs are focusing on both of these areas at the same time. But what is going to be really important for CSP edge is that we are looking at a highly distributed cloud environment and the network fabric. So starting from 20 to 50 edge data centers, which what CSPs indicated as first in terms of the size of their edge footprints. But in the long term, we expect that this number will go up to hundreds and even thousands of edge locations. So considering the sheer number and the complexity of this edge footprints, as well as the nature of the new and advanced services that CSPs are planning to deliver, network automation in these edge data centers will be a must-have, not a nice-to-have. And this is really crucial if CSPs want to play in the edge computing value chains.
Yeah, it's going to be essential. Thanks, Gorkem. Ernest, question to you. Are there any specific tasks in the data center lifecycle that you are prioritizing and automating first?
Well, there's a couple of obvious ones, of course, like the onboarding process where you start equipping your data center in certain tranches of equipment, be it racks or rows or whatever. That's an obvious one. Our first and one of the more important things is anything targeted towards, I'd call it migratory work. As I mentioned earlier, we have a legacy environment that's still there. When you want to move that over or connect to your current and modern data center fabric, those aspects would of course be first to be automated, because this is what you will need most over the run of the year or two it takes to complete your migration cycle from current to new data center fabric. So those would be a priority for us.
Great. Thank you, Ernest, for those answers. And I think we can get at least one more question in. Here's a good one. Mike, is there a role for cloud hyperscalers in all this? If so, how do these public cloud hyperscalers, how do they fit into this?
So you leave the controversial ones for hard. So that's great. Hyperscalers and CSPs, it's an interesting relationship. I think it varies geographically. I think hyperscalers look like partners. Hyperscalers look like competitors. Gorkem talked a bit about the sort of the proliferation of edge cloud, talking about pushing it all the way out to the cell sites. In those cases, the CSP footprint starts to look a little bit like a kind of a cloud hotel, where we had carrier hotels in the colos to provide connectivity. If end customers, like the enterprises that purchase SP services, if they've got applications that reside in different clouds, the question is, how do they connect those? So there is a role with the hyperscalers for sure. there's a lot of questions that come from that. What's the point of demarcation between the service provider and the CSP? Who maintains account control? Because it's, who is a partner today might look like a competitor tomorrow. So I think those are like really big strategic questions. And frankly, we would need like another hour to talk about that, even a little bit. Obviously, some of the hyperscalers have built out their own services around some of the VNFs that drive, telco cloud type deployments. And so there's opportunity to leverage that in some environments with the same kinds of considerations. Where's the point of demarc? How do you monetize? Where do the profit pools get divided? I think what people need to do from a hyperscaler perspective is, go in pretty broadly and have really deep conversations about not how to roll out a service, but how is that going to evolve over the next few years? Because I think things like what's the edge of the managed boundary? Is that really the transit gateway or the VPC gateway on the public cloud side? Or does it go into the application, like the CNI in an application instance? Understanding where that point of demarc is has huge operational implications on what tools have to be used, how policy and control is centralized, how do you scale operations across these hundreds or thousands of smaller data centers that or distributed edge clouds that we've talked about. So that's kind of what I would look at. And then on the hyperscaler side, the other thing to think about is, what are the routes to market as you think about carrying those services out? How do you scale them quickly and rapidly? So I think there's just a very rich conversation to have in this space. So absolutely, in short, do hyperscalers have a role? Absolutely, they do. Just be very thoughtful about what that role is, because you want to have a deliberate business outcome. You don't want to sort of incrementally find yourself into a business position, 2, 3, 5 years down the road that you hadn't planned for.
Great, thank you, Mike. We did keep the trickiest question there till the end, but terrific answer. Thank you very much for those comments. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, so I would like to thank all of you for sharing your views and expertise and helping to answer our audience questions. Now, don't forget, if you haven't yet watched Tuesday's discussion program with Gorkem and Ben Baker, who's Senior Director of Product Marketing over at Juniper Networks, where we unveiled the survey and discussed the results, then you can still do so. Just follow the links below this video player window. And we've got links to other related information. It's all there in the video description. Plenty for you to watch and read. For now, though, on behalf of Juniper Networks, the team here at TelecomTV, and to our guests today, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.